Today, I would like to talk about the origin of Genesis and the tablet theory. Now, the tablet theory is ignored by the historical critical scholars of the Bible. There were some back in the day when scholars did not operate from the premise of unbelief. They did consider it, and some really thought that was the answer too. And I think since then there's even more reason to believe that it is the answer. But it's been ignored, not refuted, but ignored by the historical critical scholars of the Bible. And I think that's because it is too wonderful. It is not the idea that Moses took dictation from God in his tent, as some people, the strict fundamentalist view is Moses got an inspiration and he didn't know anything about his family history until the Lord told him, and then he wrote it down, and that became Genesis. And I'm not dealing here with the other books of the Pentateuch. The books of Moses, I'm going to make the case, though, that the books of Moses, when they say that refers both to books written by Moses and books about Moses as told by his immediate ancestors. And that is going to be consistent with the creation of Genesis through the tablet theory. In other words, I'm going to say the tablet theory, I'm going to go over the history of it in a little bit here, but the basic idea of the tablet theory is that Genesis is a series of accounts, 11 or 12 of them, that were old even in the time of Moses. That Moses had records. He had his family history. He knew something about where he came from. And the patriarchs of the Bible told their stories to their immediate descendants. And those descendants wrote those stories down. And that is where Moses got the first 36 chapters of Genesis from. And the reason why we think that is because there are certain key phrases there that are repeated, called a Toledoth phrase, which I will talk about more in a little bit, that say this is an account, this is a story being told by somebody. So that is, in essence, that is the tablet theory. There is support for it. I'm going to talk about that support as I go. There were some objections to it, but what you find is that historical critical scholars operate from a premise of unbelief. That is, they assume the text is not anything supernatural. It's not anything wonderful. They're always looking for some other explanation rather than the traditional explanation for the text. And they're very quick to be imaginative and to create any scenario they can think of that shows this text is not really written by who it's said it's traditionally claimed to be written by. It's not inspired by God. It's a product of natural forces only. It was written by someone else, and they just claimed the name of Moses or whoever to sort of gain credibility. They're very quick to sort of undermine the veracity of the text. But when it comes to ways to verify the veracity of the text, they suddenly have no imagination whatsoever. And I'll explain what I mean more as I go, but suddenly they can't connect the dots. They can connect all kinds of dots to prove a premise of unbelief. But when the same dots are sitting there for a premise that sort of validates a high view of the text, suddenly their imagination disappears and they can't connect the dots anymore. And so let me start with that, and I'm going to start with that description of the tablet theory, why I think it's right. I think, they've come up with all kinds of other theories. The documentary hypothesis, that's in trouble. The supplementary, fragmentary, I think those are even worse in a way. In a way, because I'm not saying that Genesis was strictly written by these people and the folks that came afterwards added nothing to it. Some parts of it you're supposed to add. If you see that your ancestors started a genealogy, and now it's your generation, guess what? You're supposed to add to that. So if they see they started listing the descendants of Esau, and you come along 400 years later and there's been some more generations since then, you're supposed to add that in. So I'm not saying there isn't a single word in it anywhere that isn't added by anyone except the original authors. I'm saying the apple is delivered up, and polish may have been put on the apple, but that doesn't change that the origin of Genesis is basically from the tablet theory. Now, let's talk about in more detail what that is. There was a man named Wiseman, and he was a military guy. He was the military attaché for the British when they were doing some digs in Mesopotamia. And they kept finding all of these tablets, and they found them from even the time and the place where Abraham and those patriarchs were. And they noticed a pattern on the tablets. The tablets ended with, not began with, but ended with a certain phrase. This is the account of, these are the generations of. And that phrase was usually combined with maybe a couple of more lines identifying who owned the tablet, or some brief synopsis of what the account was about, or both. It served much like a colophon does in modern books today. That's the page that has the publisher, the year, the title of the work in our books today. And those pages, too, by the way, used to be in the back. My wife has some books from the 1800s. The colophon, the publisher, and all that information is in the back in older books. It was moved to the front sometime later. So, Wiseman had a hypothesis. And his hypothesis, because he noticed that in Genesis, a similar phrase, a Toledoth phrase, appeared 11 times. These are the generations of, or this, and it's by generations. That word generations in Hebrew, it's an account. It's something produced. It's not just a family line. It's broader than that. It's something begotten in many senses. Ordinarily, yeah, it's a sense of I'm having a baby. He's the father of this son. But that isn't, it's not restricted to that. And believe me, I've written a book. In a sense, you do feel like it is your baby. It's something you begot. And so he said, look, it seems to me like what this is saying is that Genesis, early Genesis, the first 36 chapters of Genesis, is a series of older accounts. And that maybe what this was an anthology by Moses. That he had these accounts from the patriarchs of the Bible, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and Noah, and Terah, and even Adam. And these accounts were put together in a series. And these Toledoth phrases, which mysteriously end at chapter 36, which is just when they should have ended, if indeed early Genesis was an anthology of earlier accounts, that's what they're trying to say. And that's how an ancient reader from Mesopotamia, which the Israelites were, that's how they would have taken this. And by the way, that is sort of one of the rules that the scholars, the unbelieving scholars, use when they are trying to debunk an idea that, okay, this has a divine meaning. They say, no, you have to limit it. It can only be interpreted the way the people of that time would have interpreted it. Well, if it has a bunch of Toledoth phrases in it, and if those were used as they were used where the children of Israel came from, guess what? That's how they would have interpreted it. They would have interpreted early Genesis as an anthology of earlier accounts, old even in the time of Moses. And when you look at it that way, it speaks to the issue of, well, we know that Genesis was borrowed from other ancient Near Eastern cultures and adapted. Those stories on there are not original because we have other stories like them from that region that are even older than Moses. Therefore, they can't be original. Well, the tablet theory undoes that, because the tablet theory says the material was old even in the time of Moses. Moses was using family history to develop early Genesis. So it now becomes an open question as to which accounts were the original accounts and which accounts were the oldest. And the reason we have the tablets from, say, Eridu or some city, some Urkesh or some ancient city over there, the reason we have those tablets and not the ones from Moses is because it was a more egalitarian society. Israel had they were nomads, they were wandering around. They didn't tax a bunch of people to build huge palaces and libraries to themselves. So their records are a lot harder to find. That's all. It's not that their records aren't just as ancient. It's just that you can't expect to find some giant palace and some giant city with a library stacked with where the kings commissioned odes to themselves. And of course, that ties right into the account of Babel. And I have another video about the account of Babel and how they said, let us build us a city. And let's make a name for ourselves. That's exactly what God did not want them to do. So they didn't have a city and they didn't have a library, but they had their history and they recorded it in tablets. And that's the way they expected ancient sacred records to come. Even though by the time of Moses, they had papyrus. They had more efficient means. They had leather scrolls. They had other ways of recording information. But they considered tablets to be the form in which sacred records were created. That's why the Ten Commandments, perhaps, had to be tablets. Moses didn't write it in a scroll, he received it in tablets. Oh, here's the most sacred version of our form in which sacred records come, and our sacred records in our family from our patriarchs, who the Lord says we're the ones who are bringing the line of Messiah into the world. These are their sacred records, and now God has made his own, the Ten Commandments, with his own hands. He has put his tablets on it too. And so that's one reason why the Ten Commandments, I think, had to come in tablets. They were used to receiving sacred records in that form. And there's some other hints too. There's the issue of gopher wood and how not even the ancient Israelites knew what gopher wood was. And I have another video about that showing why it's a hint that it's from a much earlier record. They're like us today. What's gopher wood? They didn't know either, but they assumed whoever in the past made that record knew. And then also there's a very strange number pattern on the Genesis 5 genealogy. And that number pattern, people have had different explanations for that, but none better than those ages were translated from a time when there was a different numbering system, that years varied in length, but 5-year periods and then 2-year periods could have the same length. And so large numbers were recorded in a different units. And when you translate it, it results in the strange number pattern that we see. So Wiseman, of course, he was not a scholar. His son, though, was a legit scholar of ancient Near Eastern studies, and he republished his father's work as it was and just put a little intro on there. So he bought into what his father was saying. But you might say, well, that's the guy's son. Did anybody else? And yeah, occasionally someone else would say, yes, we think the tablet theory has credence. The one where I found out about it was from this book you see here from R.K. Harrison. R.K. Harrison is a legit scholar, and he spent a lot of time in his book, Introduction to the Old Testament, talking about the tablet theory and why it makes sense. He was a defender of the tablet theory, about the last one. He talked about how we keep finding the tablets, talking about how the total loss were at the end rather than the beginning, went through where they were. And after that, the sort of critical scholarship, dirty money bought dirty scholarship, and they just dropped the subject. They didn't refute the tablet theory. They just ignored the tablet theory. They didn't like the tablet theory. And I'm going to defend the tablet theory here today. So, and I'm challenging those who claim the mantle of scholars. If you think this isn't the true explanation for how Genesis came to be, say why. Tell us why, instead of just ignoring it for decades like you've done. Climb down out of your ivy towers and talk to us. It's pretty obvious. You just go look at the wording. It says, this is the account of the creations of the heavens and the earth. Well, is there anything in chapter 2 about the heavens being created? No. Well, is there even anything in chapter 2 about the earth, the Eretz, being created? No, there isn't. That's all in chapter 1. Chapter 2, verses 4 through 6 is a bridge, sort of setting up the second account, but it's a summary. It's really part of the Toledoth of the previous account. And the two accounts are together in what chapter 5 calls the Jeshar, or Book of Adam. Okay, so the Book of Adam is two accounts. One is the account of the heavens and the earth, and the other is the account of Adam. And those two are put together in the Book of Adam. And that's what Moses started with when he compiled early Genesis. So, Eretz, the word, it can either mean land or earth, depending on the context. It's used 25 times from Genesis 1:1 to Genesis 2:6. The Eretz this, the Eretz that. It's only used twice after that in chapter 2. Both times just used, this is the land this river ran through. So it in no sense is chapter 2 an account of the heavens and the earth being created. That's chapter 1. So Genesis 2:4 through Genesis 2:6 is part of a Toledoth describing what things were like in chapter 1 before, like sort of in the midpoint. It's like if you get a book today and on the back cover there's sort of a teaser. That's kind of what it's like. It was a teaser. Hey, this is what things were like in the heavens and the earth before God started intervening. And that kind of encourages you to open up and read the rest of the book. And so that might have been, at the end of the tablet. If it was a two-sided tablet, it might have been on the edge of the tablet. We found those too. But it's not an intro to chapter 2 solely. It's not about, they've divided the chapter there, but it's really mostly pointing back to chapter 1. It's not saying an intro to chapter 2 primarily. How about Shamayim, the sky or heavens? It's used 11 times before verse 2:4, but only used twice afterwards. Both times it's just say the birds of the sky. So see, it isn't a creation account of the earth, and it is not creation account of the heavens. Instead, chapter 2:4 is a Toledoth phrase pointing back to chapter 1, and verses 5 and 6 sort of mixes Eretz with Seder, with a field, which is not in chapter 1, and with Adama, which is the ground, which is only mentioned once in chapter 1. So you can see there it's kind of bridging to chapter 2 and the account of Adam and the garden, which is not the heavens and the earth. So there are not two creation accounts in early Genesis. There are reasons why it's beyond the scope of this video. The supreme deity is referred to as Elohim in chapter 1 and given his proper name in chapter 2, but there's no reason why these can these must be from a completely different source. They are kind of from a different source. We don't know where Adam got the accounts of the heavens and the earth. And in my book, I suggest a mystical explanation, which that would turn secularists so off, I don't even know if I want to get into it. I'm talking about the kind of secular people that it's just beyond the pale to them that there could even be an Adam who was in an unfallen state, or conceive of what that might mean, whether he had some kind of communion with the creation that is beyond that we can access from. And so the idea that he could receive the account of the heavens and the earth, this sort of a mystical experience, is beyond the pale for them. But if they want to go somewhere, they'll just put it in their chat, into their maps on their phone, and they will have a conversation with ChatGPT. In other words, they don't mind receiving information from inanimate objects, and they accept it just fine. But they can't believe that Adam could have a mystical experience where he could get the account in that manner. But I don't know how he got the account, so I don't want to belabor that point. My point is simply this: there are not two creation accounts of the heavens and the earth. There's only one, and these Toledo phrases come at the end of the accounts, the end of the narrative parts of the accounts, not the beginning. So that also rules out the idea that Genesis 1:1 is a sort of a title of an account. It's not. Back in those days, the titles came at the end, and verse 2:4 is it. Now, that doesn't mean that the Toledo phrase can't come in the middle, especially because this happened twice. Basically, this happened with Noah and his descendants too in the Table of Nations. You can have a narrative account on one side of the tablet, the Toledo, and then the other side of the tablet can have a genealogy. And so that was done a couple of times, and that's part of the reason I think we see these are the generations of, and we think, oh, it's pointing to the genealogy that's after. Well, maybe it is, but it's also pointing to the narrative that's before, and that was originally what it was about. It was pointing to the narrative that was before. But they also started recording their family history. And what did the next generation do? They recorded theirs. What did the next generation do? They recorded theirs. And so it was understood that when you get a genealogy, you're supposed to keep it going. And that's what they did. And so you have the Toledo phrase at the start of chapter 5 is the second one. The first one is at the start of chapter 2. The second one is at the start of chapter 5. But it's got the account of Adam on one, in front of it, and it's got the genealogy in chapter 5 behind it. So, and that happens again, like I said, with the account of the flood and the Table of Nations in chapter 10. It's all a part of the same thing. It doesn't. I know it's confusing, especially confusing because I think when you get to Terah, that is legit. When it says these are the generations of Terah, I think that is a legit genealogy. The trouble we have, and the trouble Moses had, was that if the tablet theory is correct, this is just a huge amount of time that's being covered. And while we did find that Toledos were used over a period of thousands of years based on the archaeological finds in Mesopotamia, there's no assurance that they were used the exact same way throughout Genesis. And I'm going to give you a good example of that as we go to the end of what I believe is the narrative of his family history that Moses inherited. As I've said, historical critical scholars really don't give a reason why they don't talk about the tablet theory anymore. They just won't talk about it. And they've talked about all kinds of silly theories, each one of them as bad as the original as far as an explanation for Genesis goes. The documentary hypothesis is floundering, and then they come up with other theories based on a similar framework. They're also floundering. But again, they won't talk about the documentary hypothesis. And I imagine if they did, what they would say about it, because I'm basing it on some things that R.K. Harrison said, that it seems like the theory gets in trouble when you get to the end. When you get to the latter chapters of Genesis, you've got the Toledoth of Isaac and Ishmael, Jacob and Esau, and it seems strange that one brother would tell the other story. Would not seem strange that sons would tell their father's story, but it would seem strange that one brother tells another brother's story. And also what we would consider the good brother, though there are no good guys in this account. Jesus is the good guy in the Bible. We're all the bad guys. We don't get to be the good guy. He is. So they seem to have very little press. The bad brothers get more press. They get longer Toledoths. And so they say, well, see, that just shows there's nothing to this tablet theory business. They don't say that. They don't say anything. They're just trying to ignore it and hope that it'll go away. I don't think it's going to go away because it's the answer. It's the answer that they dare not speak because it's too wonderful that we could have the account of these very, very ancient patriarchs that was preserved from Moses. And then he recorded those words, and now it's given to us today. And so it's fantastic. It's awe-inspiring. And historical critical scholars don't want Scripture to be awe-inspiring. They want it to be something like a lab rat that they're dissecting and just making comments about, oh, interesting how these parts fit together, but nothing divine in it. They want to see nothing divine in it. But it doesn't break down. It doesn't break down. All you have to do is use a little imagination. And I said earlier how the same critical historical scholars, how they come up with all kinds of fanciful ways to undermine the veracity of the Bible, but suddenly their imagination vanishes when it comes to a way to make it make sense. And here's the way you make it make sense. Isaac and Jacob had similar problem, and they handled it in a similar manner. What was their problem? Well, they were in a tumultuous relationship with their warlike brothers. That was their problem they had. They had sort of usurped their older warlike brothers and their clans. And if you had taken the family blessing or you had taken the family property and you were also taking the right to tell your father's story, you know what you do to smooth that over? You make your brother the co-author. And you give him a lot more press than you give yourself. And that very common sense reason explains the difficulties in the last four Toledoths of Jacob and Esau and Isaac and Ishmael. It fits what the text does perfectly. And I guess later scribes may have seen, oh, well, he's really going over the whole family of Esau here. He's basically making a genealogy. Wherever there's a genealogy, we're supposed to add to it. And so they added to it. Because that's what you do with genealogies. You had carte blanche to continue it. And so they did. But all Jacob was trying to do was to keep it from starting trouble, that he was writing the account of Isaac. That's all he was trying to do. And what Isaac was trying to do was to keep out of trouble with Ishmael and his warlike relatives. And so what do? You make them the co-author. You have two Toledoths. The early Genesis ends with two double Toledoths. They're really describing the longer story of the people before them. The brothers are not writing about each other's life story. It's just that the brother who did the writing is trying to diffuse the situation that he's doing the writing, even though the other guy is the older brother, by giving the older brother credit as a co-author and actually being even more elaborate in describing his brother's family than he is his own. That's all there is to it. So that is the very basics of the tablet theory. Just a little touch on it. And there's much more that could be said about it. And I wish that the scholars would give up and repent of their premise of unbelief, because I think they are the guys who could really flesh it out and make sense of it on this basis. They could use their knowledge to understand more about the Word of God. But the premise of unbelief blinds people. It does not permit them to see what the text is saying. For example, I think it's, the fragmentary hypothesis is sort of going the opposite direction. Instead of saying Moses wrote the Pentateuch, or I will say Moses and his immediate heirs wrote the Pentateuch, they would say, no, it's a series of fragments that all came together and has no coherent or underlying thing. Listen, the Genesis has an underlying and coherent theme, and it's about Messiah. In fact, even in the first creation account, the work and person of Christ are referenced at least a dozen times. I have another video about that, but there is an underlying and coherent thing in Moses, and that is the work and person of Christ. I do thank you for listening, and I appreciate your time, and may God bless you.